parchment was brittle. The ink faded to sepia tones that spoke of centuries long past. It smelled of mildew and dry rot, a faint, almost sweet scent that clung to the air in the cramped, damp sacristy of the village church. Father Marek, his fingers trembling not from age but from a nameless dread that had taken root deep in his soul, dipped his quill into the well one more time. The scratching sound it made, barely audible above the howling wind outside, felt like a desperate gasp in the suffocating silence of the night. It was the winter of 1683, and the deep forests of the old country had begun to stir with something profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. For generations, the people of this isolated, forgotten corner of Eastern Europe had lived in uneasy truce with the ancient woods. Superstition was their only shield, their faith a thin veneer against the primeval forces they instinctively knew lurked just beyond the firelight. They whispered tales of men who shed their skin under the moon. But these were stories to keep children close to home, not the reality pressing down on the village now. Marek's latest entry was stark, terse, almost frantic. Broken cattle. Again, not torn, but disarticulated, as if something exploded from within. And old Yaver's youngest, Ilara, gone, vanished from the edge of the clearing. Only tracks in the snow, too large for wolf, too small for bear, and then nothing. Just the silence and the shadow. I swear by God, a shadow, taller than a man, fleeting in the periphery of my sight, moving through the pines like the wind itself. His hand shook, spattering ink across the page, a dark, permanent stain. The villagers, poor, simple folk, spoke of spirits, of the devil's work. Marek, however, had seen the terror in their eyes, the hollow fear that wasn't born of simple folklore, but of something far older, far more insidious, something that preyed not just on their bodies, but on the very fabric of their reality. Their innocence, their desperate attempts to explain the inexplicable, was merely a tragic echo in the vast, indifferent darkness that was now, undeniably, awake. 340 years later, the roar of a 70-ton Fellerbuncher ripped through the crisp autumn air of the North American wilderness, a sound as primal and unforgiving as any ancient forest spirit. The scent of raw pine sap, diesel fuel, and damp earth hung heavy, a pungent cocktail that was the very essence of the logging camp. Here, miles from anywhere, where the vast, uninterrupted expanse of forest blurred the line between the United States and Canada, a different kind of man wrestled with a different kind of wild. This was a world of hard angles and brute force. The camp itself was a collection of heavy-duty, weathered trailers, connected by a snarl of cables and generators, all huddled together in a clearing like a small, desperate island in a sea of green and gold. Days were a relentless rhythm of felling, delimbing, and stacking, the air thick with the whirring of chainsaws and the percussive thud of logs hitting earth. Nights were simpler, a brutal yet reliable routine. Hot food from the mess hall, card games over cheap beer, the easy, rough camaraderie of men who understood the language of sweat and muscle, and the quiet satisfaction of a day's labor. This was their life, a tough but honest grind, far from the frantic pace of the cities they'd mostly left behind. Alex, 38, a man whose eyes held the distant, haunted look of a combat veteran, found a strange kind of peace in this unforgiving landscape. He'd traded the chaotic urgency of battlefield medicine for the rhythmic, demanding simplicity of the forest, the precise art of operating a skidder pulling massive logs from the cutting zone. His past as a medic in the army had honed his observational skills to a razor's edge, a habit that refused to die. He noticed the minute shifts in the wind, the subtle changes in the forest's mood, the way a man carried his exhaustion. Here, out in the vast, indifferent wilderness, he sought not just solitude, but a quiet kind of redemption, a way to forget the things he'd seen. He knew his crewmates, or thought he did. Frank, the grizzled, iron-jawed foreman, was a man carved from granite and stubbornness. He believed in facts, in the tangible, in what a man could see and touch. Frank saw a tree, a saw, and a paycheck. Anything else was just nonsense. Then there was Elias, the wildlife biologist, though Old Hunter felt a more fitting title. Elias had worked these woods for decades, his skin like worn leather, his eyes deep and knowing, like a man who had seen too much and said too little. He moved with a quiet, almost spectral grace, always on the fringes, always watching, always listening. There was an unspoken weight he carried, a secret history etched into the lines around his eyes, a profound understanding of the forest that went far beyond scientific data. Alex felt an instinctive, almost primal, trust in Elias, a sense that the old man knew things the rest of them couldn't even begin to imagine. Among the other hands were Jim, a burly, good-natured logger whose booming laugh often cut through the camp's din, and Earl, a quiet younger man known for his meticulous care of the crew's heavier tools. The rest were a revolving cast of faces, mostly quiet, hard-working men, drawn by the promise of decent wages and the brutal beauty of the wilderness. The shift in the woods began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a slow tide turning. At first it was small things. The deer, usually skittish, grew eerily quiet, their movements hushed, almost furtive, as if holding their breath. Or conversely, they'd burst from cover in a blind, panicked frenzy, scattering into the underbrush as if pursued by an unseen terror. Squirrels stopped chattering. The ceaseless cacophony of small forest creatures, the rustle and chirp and scurry that formed the wood's natural soundtrack, dwindled to an unnatural quiet. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on your arms stand up, the kind that screamed predator. Then came the disappearances from the camp itself. Not people, not yet, but small, vital things. A logger's prized hunting knife vanished from his belt while he worked. A roll of insulated wire gone from the supply shed. A bag of jerky pilfered from a cooler. Frank, ever practical, blamed bears or a particularly bold coyote. Forest spirits, eh? He'd grumble, trying to inject a note of dismissive humor, but even his gravelly voice carried a tremor of unease. Alex, however, felt a deeper chill. Bears were opportunistic, not neat. They didn't take things without leaving a mess, and the way the small, quiet sounds of the woods had become amplified, the sense of being constantly, subtly watched. It was more than just a passing animal. Elias, meanwhile, said nothing, his gaze distant, his jaw tight. But Alex saw the grim set of his mouth, the way his eyes tracked the shadows, and knew Elias felt it too. Something was out there, something other. The real cold began on a Tuesday. Young Billy, barely 20, fresh from the city, didn't report back to the mess hall for dinner. He'd been assigned to a remote section, a few miles out, felling younger pines. At first Frank just scoffed. Probably got himself turned around or found a hidden flask. A few of the crew went out in a pickup calling his name, their voices swallowed by the deepening gloom. The forest, already quiet, seemed to press in, the trees standing like silent, watchful sentinels. as the last sliver of an orange sun bled out of the sky, giving way to an oppressive inky black. The unease in the camp solidified into something colder, sharper. Billy was not just lost. He was gone. The simple, reliable routine of their lives had shattered, replaced by a growing, formless anxiety that hummed in the heavy autumn air. The quiet whispers of the ancient forests, it seemed, had finally found an ear. The dawn arrived not with a gentle promise, but with a shroud. A thick, pearlescent mist had rolled in overnight, blanketing the forest floor and rising to cling to the lower branches of the pines. It muted all sounds, amplified all shadows, and deepened the already profound sense of isolation that permeated the logging camp. The air was cold, biting at the exposed skin, carrying the metallic tang of coming rain. Frank, his face drawn and etched with a worry that he stubbornly refused to acknowledge, organized the search party. He barked orders, his voice rougher than usual, trying to project an unwavering certainty he clearly didn't feel. "He's probably got a twisted ankle," he insisted, his eyes avoiding those of his crew. "Stumbled off the path, hit his head. We'll find him." Alex, his medic's instincts overriding his fatigue, volunteered for the lead search group. He moved with a practiced, economical gait, his eyes constantly scanning, his ears straining against the unnatural quiet. The usual forest sounds, the rustle of foraging animals, the distant call of a hawk, the murmur of wind through the high canopy, were conspicuously absent. It was a dead silence, the kind that only happened when a greater predator was on the prowl, holding the entire ecosystem in its suffocating thrall. His breath plumed out in ragged clouds as they pushed deeper, the mist clinging to their faces, making every tree look like a ghostly sentinel. He noticed the way Elias moved beside him, a silent, almost preternatural tracker, his head cocked slightly, as if listening to frequencies beyond human hearing. After nearly 2 hours of slogging through the damp underbrush, past freshly cut stumps and piles of dileming waste, they found it. Not Billy, but the place where he had been. It was in a small, relatively open patch of woods, where the feller buncher had cleared a swath the previous day. A few young pines still stood, but many had been recently toppled, their shattered crowns now serving as morbid markers. Billy's bright orange safety helmet lay neatly beside a backpack, his chainsaw still and silent next to them. It was too orderly, too quiet. The scene itself hummed with a disturbing wrongness. The ground, soft with pine needles and damp soil, bore deep, irregular indentations, as if something impossibly heavy had impacted it, or something had writhed there with incredible force. And then they saw it, a scattering of torn fabric, a few scraps of bright yellow and red flannel, stained an alarming dark crimson. Blood. So much blood. It soaked into the earth, staining the pine needles, the color of rust and despair. Frank, upon seeing the scene, visibly blanched. The last vestiges of his bravado crumbled. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice thin. "What in God's name?" Alex felt a cold dread begin to solidify in his gut. This wasn't a bear attack. This was something far, far worse. The true horror, however, lay nearby, partially hidden beneath a fallen log. What remained of Billy? It wasn't merely gnawed or eaten, the way a bear or a pack of wolves might leave a carcass. It was a grotesque, unrecognizable tableau of pulverized tissue and bone. His clothes were not just ripped. They were shredded to confetti, soaked through with blood and something else, something viscous and slick. The few pieces of bone that were identifiable were the most chilling. A femur snapped cleanly in half, but with the jagged ends splayed outwards, as if something had pushed through it, rather than chewed on it. A set of ribs not cracked or broken, but warped, twisted into unnatural spirals, some of them punched clean through, leaving ragged, gaping holes. It was as if his body had been used as a container, and whatever was inside had decided to escape, violently, from the deepest reaches of his core. There was a sickening, almost sweet stench in the air, a mixture of blood and something else, something metallic and organic and utterly alien. Frank, his face pale and clammy, clung to his dwindling sanity. "A rogue grizzly," he stammered, his voice tight with desperation. "A real monster of a bear, gone crazy. That's all it could be." He looked from face to face, pleading for affirmation, but no one met his gaze. The loggers, hardened men all, were clearly shaken, their faces grim, their eyes wide with a primal fear. Alex looked at Frank, then at Elias. The old hunter said nothing, his face a mask of profound, ancient sorrow, his eyes holding a terrible knowledge that surpassed any immediate fear. Alex knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that no bear, no matter how aggressive, could have done this. This was not the work of an animal driven by hunger or territoriality. This was something else, something that defied natural law, something that had a horrifying purpose beyond simple predation. Elias, who had been silently circling the perimeter of the gruesome scene, knelt down, his gaze fixed on the churned earth near the largest pool of blood. He pointed, his finger trembling slightly. Alex and Frank drew closer, their eyes following the direction of his gaze. There, imprinted in the damp soil, were two distinct sets of tracks. One set was enormous, far larger than any wolf, with splayed, powerful paw prints, claw marks clearly visible, leading deeper into the woods. And right beside them, sometimes overlapping, sometimes a whisper of an inch apart, were another set of prints, unmistakable, perfectly formed human footprints. Bare feet, not boot prints, but the impression of human toes, an arch, a heel. As they followed the tracks with their eyes, a chilling realization dawned. The human prints weren't just beside the animal prints. They gradually began to merge, to overlap and intertwine, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The two forms, visibly in the process of becoming one, left a terrifying transitional record in the mud. Elias looked up, his eyes meeting Alex's. There was no need for words. The unspoken terror in their gazes was a mutual acknowledgement. The thing that had taken Billy was not an animal, and it was certainly not human. It was something in between, something unspeakable. The brigade staggered back to camp, a ragged procession of defeated men. The mist had begun to lift, replaced by a low, leaden sky that seemed to press down on them, reflecting their internal gloom. The boisterous camaraderie that had once defined their days was utterly shattered. Fear, a cold, insidious thing, had seeped into every crevice of their collective spirit, replacing trust with suspicion. Men who had shared swill coffee and dirty jokes for weeks now regarded each other with wary, hostile eyes. Arguments flared, sharp and meaningless, as they tried to articulate the inarticulable, to find a rational hook for the horror they had witnessed. Frank, his face a mask of grim defeat, still muttered about some kind of mutation, a freak animal, but the conviction had fled his voice. leaving only a hollow echo. The immediate attempts to contact the outside world were met with a terrifying, absolute silence. The crackle of the two-way radios, usually a reliable link to the nearest small town, faded into an ominous static, then died completely. Alex fiddled with the dials, his brow furrowed, but all he got was a dead hiss, as if the very air refused to carry their desperate cries. The satellite phones, their small screens usually beaming with bars of service, now showed only no signal, their digital silence more chilling than any interference. They were truly cut off, marooned in the vast ocean of forest. As if to underscore their complete isolation, the camp's massive diesel generator, which had hummed a continuous, comforting rhythm for weeks, suddenly coughed, sputtered, and died, plunging the clearing into a profound, suffocating darkness. The only light now came from the dying embers of the communal fire pit, and the occasional beam of a flashlight, weak and vulnerable against the encroaching night. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. With nightfall, the forest outside the camp perimeter seemed to come alive, but with a horrifying, unnatural vitality. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs in the underbrush, were no longer merely the sounds of the wind or small animals. They were deliberate, precise, like footsteps. Sometimes a low, guttural sound would drift through the trees, not quite a howl, not quite a growl. It was deeper, more resonant, carrying an inflection that was almost, but not quite, human. A distorted, guttural speech, a rasping, choking sound that seemed to mock the very idea of language. It was the sound of something monstrous imitating speech, playing a cruel trick. The temperature dropped, falling to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cold seemed to carry the sounds directly into the very bones of the huddled men. Desperation drove a small group led by a burly logger named Gus to attempt a breakout. They piled into the camp's only functioning heavy-duty pickup truck, hoping to reach the nearest ranger station some 40 miles east. Frank had tried to dissuade them, but the panic was too great. The rumble of the engine faded into the night, a brief, fragile beacon of hope swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. 2 hours later, the hope died. The truck was found abandoned on the logging road barely 5 miles out. Its heavy-duty tires were shredded, not from normal punctures, but as if something had clawed them apart. The engine block, astonishingly, was torn from its mountings, lying uselessly beside the chassis, steaming faintly in the chill night air. And Gus, along with his 2 companions, were gone. The tally of the missing grew, a silent, terrifying count. Alex took the first watch, a rifle clutched tightly in his hands, his back pressed against the cold metal of his trailer. His senses were on high alert, every nerve ending screaming. The low, guttural sounds from the forest were almost continuous now, a horrifying chorus that seemed to encircle the small, trembling camp. Then a new sound cut through the oppressive darkness. It was a whisper, distinct and heartbreakingly clear, carried on a gust of wind. "Help me, please." It was thin, ragged, a sound of absolute anguish. It vibrated with a horrifying familiarity. It sounded like Billy, and echoed the desperate cries Gus surely made. Alex instinctively raised his hunting rifle, aiming it into the inky blackness from which the voice had come. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But he saw nothing. Only the impenetrable, featureless darkness of the forest, an endless maw swallowing all light, all hope. The whisper came again, closer this time, just beyond the range of his meager flashlight. "Don't leave me. It hurts." The words were twisted, choked, as if spoken by a throat that was no longer quite human. It was a sickening psychological torment, a grotesque mockery. They were being toyed with, their hope weaponized against them. The realization was more terrifying than any direct attack. The enemy out there wasn't just physical. It was intelligent. It was cruel. And it knew their names. It knew their fear. And it was savoring every agonizing moment of their slow, terrifying descent into despair. Hysteria had fully engulfed the camp. Sleep had become a forgotten luxury, replaced by the grating gnaw of fear and the constant vigilance of men who knew, with sickening certainty, that they were being hunted. Every trailer was a makeshift fortress, windows boarded up with hastily scavenged lumber, doors barricaded with tools and furniture. Men huddled together in desperate, silent groups, clutching axes, wrenches, anything that could serve as a weapon. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. The low, guttural sounds from the forest had intensified, a relentless percussion against the thin walls of their shelters. The last pathetic remnants of Frank's bear theory had finally collapsed under the weight of accumulating horrors, leaving a gaping void where logic once stood. In the midst of this escalating panic, Elias, who had remained a silent, watchful sentinel throughout the ordeal, finally stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was low but cut through the simmering chaos like a sharpened blade. He spoke with an authority that seemed to emanate not just from his physical presence, but from the ancient, heavy knowledge etched into his weathered face. His eyes, usually distant, now held a fierce, unwavering intensity that commanded attention. Quiet. He barked, and to everyone's surprise, the frantic whispers and nervous shuffles ceased. Every eye in the crowded mess hall trailer turned to him, a desperate, unspoken plea for answers. Elias walked to the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the terrified loggers. His voice, though calm, was imbued with a quiet power that drew them in. "You've heard the old stories," he began, "about shapeshifters, about men who turn into wolves under the moon." A nervous murmur ran through the group. "Those are children's tales," he continued, his voice hardening, distorted whispers of a truth far more ancient, far more terrible. He spoke of isolated communities, of unexplained disappearances, of a pervasive, creeping dread that had haunted the fringes of human habitation for centuries. He revealed with a weary resignation that he had spent decades, his entire adult life, piecing together fragments of these legends, sifting through forgotten texts and local folklore. He had been ridiculed, dismissed as a madman, a superstitious fool. Now, in the stark, terrifying reality of their situation, his quiet obsession felt like prophecy. "They are not men who turn into beasts," Elias explained, his gaze piercing. "That is the simple, comforting lie we tell ourselves. It makes them comprehensible. It makes them seem like a twisted reflection of us." He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air, allowing the true horror to sink in. "No, they do not change. They are something else entirely. Ancient predators. Parasites that have coexisted with humanity, not among us, but on us. They don't live alongside people, Alex," he said, turning to meet Alex's gaze directly. "They replace them." A collective gasp, half horror, half disbelief, rippled through the room. Alex felt a cold, leaden weight settle in his stomach, The words, horrifying as they were, resonated with a terrible truth. The broken bones, the strange merging tracks, the stolen items, the distorted whispers. It all suddenly clicked into place, forming a coherent, grotesque picture. Every attack, every disappearance, Elias continued, his voice now a low, chilling whisper, is not merely an act of violence or predation. It is a process. The human body becomes a cocoon for something new, something other. Those bones we found, Billy's bones, not simply gnawed clean but broken from the inside. That was the moment of emergence. That was the hatching. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, as if the very act of speaking these words caused him physical pain. The body, the one we know, the person we knew, is not a victim. It is an incubator, a vessel. And what comes out is not the person. It is not even an animal. It is the creature that used the human as a shell, a launching platform. They break their way out. They are born from within us. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The terrible, unthinkable truth had been spoken aloud, stripping away all pretense, all comforting lies. The ordinary had not just been invaded by the horrific. The ordinary was the horrific, twisted into a design beyond human comprehension. The fear in the room had deepened, becoming a cold, profound terror that left them all breathless, exposed to a reality far more monstrous than any legend. Elias's words, a chilling pronouncement delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had seen too much, hung heavy in the stale air of the mess hall. They detonated a maelstrom of emotions. Frank, ever the pragmatist, erupted in a furious rejection, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "That's hogwash, Elias. Madman's talk. There's no such thing as things bursting out of people. It's an animal, a goddamn bear, maybe a pack of wolves gone rabid, that's all." His voice cracked, a desperate attempt to cling to the familiar, the explicable. Other men stared, their faces pale, eyes wide and unblinking, lost in a daze of shock and utter horror. Some simply swayed, as if physically buffeted by the impossible truth. But Alex felt a different, colder sensation. Not disbelief, but a profound, sickening horror that settled deep in his bones. Elias's explanation, no matter how outlandish, how monstrous, fit every single piece of the gruesome puzzle. The shattered, inwardly broken bones, the merging footprints, the selective disappearances, the strange, intelligent sounds in the night, it all made a terrible, undeniable sense. His medic's mind, trained to observe, analyze, and diagnose, found no flaw in Elias's terrifying hypothesis. It was a perfect, horrifying explanation for the inexplicable. He looked at Elias, then back at the bewildered faces of the loggers, and a chill worse than any autumn night spread through him. They weren't just facing a monster. They were facing a reality far more insidious. Elias, seeing their terror, continued, his voice a low, steady thrum. "We are not just victims, gentlemen. We are to them merely a resource, a means to an end. We are livestock. And they," he gestured vaguely toward the impenetrable darkness beyond the reinforced walls, "are the most patient, most cunning predators this world has ever known. They move like smoke, they watch like shadows, and they have the patience of stone. They can mimic, they can lure, and they can wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for centuries, for the moment to strike." He detailed their almost supernatural ability to hide, to blend, to be utterly invisible until they chose to reveal themselves, a fleeting glimpse, a sudden snatch. They were not brutes. They were intelligence honed by eons of existence. A grim resolve began to harden within Alex. The initial shock gave way to a desperate, cold determination. He had faced impossible odds before, had seen things no man should see, and had learned the hard lessons of survival. This wasn't a time for debate or despair. It was a time for action. He stepped forward, his voice steady, surprising himself. "All right," he said, "then we fight." He looked at Elias, then at the few remaining loggers who seemed to be regaining some semblance of themselves. "Frank, we need to shore up these defenses." "Elias, you know these things. What do we do?" The atmosphere in the mess hall began to shift, imperceptibly at first, from paralyzed panic to a fragile, desperate resolve. Alex, with Elias's grim nod of approval, began to organize. They scavenged every tool, every piece of metal, every length of chain. They barricaded every opening, reinforcing the thin walls of the trailers, turning their meager camp into a desperate, fragile bastion against the encroaching night. Axes, crowbars, even a few long-handled wrenches were distributed, becoming their last line of defense. The air now hummed not just with fear, but with a new, terrifying energy of impending battle. They were still in the midst of reinforcing the back wall of the supply trailer, using a heavy-duty pallet as a makeshift door when the attack came. It wasn't a gradual approach, no creeping dread. It was a sudden, violent eruption from the surrounding darkness. A blur of movement, too fast to properly register. A flash of something dark and impossibly flexible, covered in coarse, matted hair. It moved with the speed of a pouncing cat, but with a terrifying, almost liquid grace. A man named Doug, an older logger who had been struggling with a stubborn nail, barely had time to let out a choked gasp before the thing was on him. Alex saw a brief, horrifying glimpse of gnashing fangs, eyes that reflected the dim light with an alien, predatory gleam, and limbs that seemed to twist and contort at impossible angles. Doug was yanked backward, his scream cut short, swallowed by the darkness in a matter of seconds. He simply ceased to exist, pulled into the blackness as if he had never been there. The violence was instantaneous, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. During the frenzied, heart-pounding attack, as the remaining men screamed and cursed, fumbling with their meager weapons, Alex heard it again. Not a growl, not a roar, but something far more chilling. It was a strange, grating sound, a wet, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate from the very air itself. It sounded like a word, twisted and mangled, forced through a throat not meant for human speech. Billy. It rasped, a sound that tore at Alex's soul, echoing the name of their first lost comrade. Then another sound choked and distorted. Gus. It was not a call for help, but a grotesque, sadistic parody of it. It was a declaration. These things weren't just killing them, they were taunting them. They understood. They knew. The realization slammed into Alex with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a brutal predator. It possessed a malevolent, twisted intelligence, reveling in their fear, demonstrating an almost playful cruelty. The horror deepened, burrowing into the marrow of his bones. This was no mere beast in the woods. This was an entity that mocked the very essence of humanity, a nightmare made flesh that wore the faces of the lost. Elias, his face grim, surveyed the devastated camp. The fresh bloodstains, the lingering stench of fear, the new gaping hole in their meager defenses where Doug had been snatched. It all pointed to an undeniable truth. "There is no salvation here," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "A simple statement of fact. This place is compromised. We're cornered, just waiting to be picked off." He pointed a gnarled finger deeper into the impenetrable blackness of the forest, away from the logging roads, away from any semblance of civilization. "There's an old farm miles from here, abandoned decades ago. Only hermits and trappers know of it. They say the forest thins out there. Old growth gives way to scrub. It's our only chance. The old blood finds it harder to hunt where the trees don't provide deep shadows. Under the oppressive blanket of a moonless night, the remaining survivors, a skeletal crew of 5, Alex, Elias, Frank, Jim, and Earl, silently abandoned the camp. They moved like shadows, each man a shadow, trying to make as little sound as possible. The air was a biting 45 degrees Fahrenheit, each breath a frosty plume. Alex, gripping his rifle, felt every nerve ending thrumming with an electric tension. The journey was a descent into a living nightmare. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig, a potential death sentence. The vast, indifferent forest, once a source of solace for Alex, had transformed into a monstrous, living entity, its ancient trees looming like watchful giants, their branches clawing at the ink-black sky. As they pushed deeper, Elias, with his preternatural tracking skills, confirmed their worst fears. They found fresh, unmistakable signs of the creature's passage. A strip of torn denim, still clinging to a thorn bush, too low to have come from a deer. Further on, in a patch of soft loam near a babbling brook, a chilling set of tracks, the enormous splayed paw prints, and intertwined with them, the faint sickening impressions of bare human feet. It was undeniable. The creatures were not just following them. They were herding them, driving them in a specific direction, like cattle to the slaughter. The realization was a cold, bitter pill to swallow. They weren't escaping. They were merely moving to the next stage of the hunt. The true torment, however, was psychological. The predators played with them, a cruel, insidious game of cat and mouse. Distant whispers would drift through the trees just at the edge of hearing, like a faint, agonizing call for help. Then, a sudden, sharp crack of a branch directly behind them, followed by an immediate, profound silence. The paranoia became a suffocating weight. The men began to crack. Jim, a burly, usually good-natured logger, started mumbling to himself, his eyes darting frantically. "They're everywhere, aren't they? Right behind us. I can feel 'em," he hissed, his voice rising. Earl, a younger man, tried to calm him, but the fear was contagious. Jim suddenly screamed, a primal, ragged cry of pure terror, throwing his hands up. "Get away from me, you filthy things!" His outburst was a beacon in the oppressive darkness, a siren song for the unseen horrors. Before Alex or Frank could react, a dark shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of the trees. It moved with impossible speed, a blur of dark fur and flashing claws. Jim's scream cut off abruptly, a wet, gurgling sound, as he was dragged into the undergrowth. There was a sickening snap of bones, a muffled thrashing, and then once again, the profound, terrifying silence. Only 4 remained. During a brief, desperate respite, huddled under the dripping boughs of a massive fir tree, Elias shared fragments of his past. His voice was low, raspy, as if the words were pulled from a deep, hidden well of pain. "I had a partner back in 1988, he began, his eyes fixed on the impenetrable darkness, a good man, a tracker like me. We were deep in the Red River country, mapping out some rare species. He just vanished. One night, like smoke, left his pack, his rifle, everything, just gone. He paused, a deep, shuddering breath. Then there was Sarah, a research assistant. Smart girl. Disappeared from her campsite not a mile from the highway. Everyone blamed a bear, but I saw the tracks. The other tracks. His voice grew heavy with a sorrow that transcended mere grief. My own grandfather. He told me stories, old country tales. He warned me. Said some things in the woods aren't meant to be understood, only fought. Elias looked at Alex, his gaze holding a profound, unsettling weight. This isn't a new fight, Alex. It's an old one. And I've been in it a long, long time. His words were not just a sharing of personal history. They were a chilling confirmation of a war that stretched back through generations. A battle against an enemy that stalked not just the forests, but the very edge of human comprehension. He was not just an old hunter. He was a sentinel, a lonely warrior in a timeless, horrifying conflict. After what felt like an eternity, but amounted to only a few days of relentless, gut-wrenching travel, the forest began to show signs of yielding. The towering ancient pines thinned, replaced by a less dense stand of younger firs and deciduous trees. The ground became less rugged, the undergrowth less choked. Exhaustion weighed on Alex like a shroud, his muscles screaming, his stomach a hollow pit. Hunger gnawed, a constant dull ache, and his throat was raw from thirst. But then, through a break in the heavy, low-hanging mist that always seemed to cling to these woods, he saw it. The faint, spectral silhouette of an old farm. A dilapidated farmhouse, its roof sagging, and a sagging listing barn, both swallowed by the encroaching overgrowth. A desperate, almost delusional spark of hope ignited within him. It presented itself as a mirage, a cruel trick of his exhausted mind, but Alex clung to the hope it offered. As they drew closer, the signs became clearer, solidifying the fragile hope into a desperate yearning. This was indeed a place that had once hummed with human life. The field that stretched before the house, now overgrown with tall weeds and scrub brush, still bore the faint, ghost-like furrows of long-abandoned cultivation. The air, though still carrying the damp, earthy scent of the wilderness, also held a subtle aroma of stale wood smoke and decay. They found makeshift barricades, crudely constructed from fallen logs and rusted farm equipment, leaning against the crumbling walls of the farmhouse. Inside what had once been a chicken coop, the charred remains of old campfires lay cold, surrounded by empty, rusted food cans, a macabre still life of former occupants. It was a stark testament that others had sought refuge here. Others had tried to make a stand against whatever terror stalked these woods. This place was not just a shelter. It was a battleground, a last-ditch effort by people like themselves. For a fleeting moment, a dangerous thought bloomed in Alex's mind, daring him to believe some had survived. As they cautiously approached the farmhouse, a deeper dread began to seep into the cracks of their hope. The silence that hung over the farm was not the gentle quiet of abandonment. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of death. There were crude symbols, deeply carved into the weathered wood of the farmhouse doors, rudimentary crosses, interlocking circles, symbols that spoke of desperate attempts at warding off evil. They were old, faded, but still held a faint aura of fear. And then they found the blood. Dried, rust-colored stains on the porch steps, on the rough-hewn floorboards of the entryway. Not massive pools, but scattered spatters. marking the place where someone had bled before they were removed. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows. Just an eerie, unsettling stillness, as if life had simply ceased, abruptly, without a fight. Frank, his voice a hoarse croak, shattered the silence. "Hello? Is anyone here?" he called out, his voice thin and hopeful, but it was swallowed by the vast, indifferent air. Only the wind whistling through a broken pane of glass answered him. Elias's face, already etched with the deep lines of a weary knowledge, darkened further. "They wouldn't have lasted long," he murmured, his voice barely audible, his gaze sweeping over the desolate scene. "Not against what truly hides in these woods. Not in a place that has been known to the things for so long." His words extinguished the last flickering ember of hope, plunging them back into the cold, stark reality of their predicament. Elias, his movements slow and deliberate, led them to the back of the farmhouse. Hidden by a tangle of thorny bushes and overgrown weeds, they found it. A cellar entrance. It was a set of heavy wooden doors, rotting and warped, secured by a thick rusted chain and a padlock as big as a fist. The air that seeped from beneath the doors was thick with a cloying, sickly, sweet smell, an odor of decay and something else, something metallic and organic, that made Alex's stomach clench. "This was their last refuge," Elias whispered, a profound sense of foreboding in his voice. He reached down, his hands surprisingly strong for his age, and with a grunt of effort, he ripped the rusted padlock from its moorings. The heavy chain clattered to the ground. The doors creaked open with a mournful groan, revealing a gaping maw of absolute darkness, and the sickening stench that wafted up was even stronger, almost overwhelming. It was the smell of rot, of forgotten things, and of something unspeakably wrong. This, Elias's eyes conveyed, was where their journey truly began, a place that held their end. A single, weak beam from Alex's tactical flashlight was their only guide as they hesitated at the threshold of the cellar. The air that billowed up from the darkness was a thick, visceral assault. A nauseating, sickly sweet concoction of decay, damp earth, mildew, and something else. A coppery metallic tang interwoven with a deep, organic stench that settled in the back of Alex's throat. It tasted like old blood and new rot. Dread, heavy and suffocating, pressed down on them. Elias, with a resolute sigh, led the way down the rickety wooden steps, his old bones creaking in protest. Alex followed, rifle held ready, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Frank surprisingly brought up the rear, his face a grim mask of resolve. Earl, his face pale and gripped by a palpable fear, clutched a heavy logging axe, his knuckles white. The flashlight beam, a fragile spear of light, cut through the oppressive blackness, sweeping across a scene that instantly eradicated any lingering hope. This was no refuge. This was a crypt, a grotesque, charnel house that defied all earthly understanding. The cellar was not empty. It was filled, not with survivors, but with death, and something far, far worse. The beam stuttered across a grim tableau of horror. Human bodies, or what remained of them, were scattered across the damp earth floor, propped against rough-hewn support beams, sprawled in horrifying repose. They were in various states of decomposition, some horribly bloated, others shriveled and dry, their forms still vaguely recognizable as the hermits Elias had spoken of. But they were not merely dead. They were changed, twisted, transformed, Their faces, frozen in silent screams or vacant stares, were horrifyingly human, yet something monstrous had been done to them. The skins of the bodies were stretched taut, like drum heads, glistening with a viscous sheen in the faint light. In places, the skin had torn, not from external damage but from within, revealing what lay beneath. Bones, Elias's words echoing in Alex's mind, were grotesquely deformed, bent and twisted into impossible angles, like brittle branches snapped by an unseen internal force. These were the cocoons Elias had described, still incubating, still holding their monstrous secrets. The sweet, sick odor of their transformation was overwhelming, almost palpable, making Alex gag. As they stood, transfixed by the horror, a low, wet sound echoed in the suffocating silence. One of the bodies, a particularly bloated form propped against a storage barrel, began to twitch. A shudder rippled through the corpse, then a violent, convulsive spasm. The stretched skin, already too tight, began to tear, not along a wound, but from the inside out, like fruit bursting its rind. A grotesque, bulbous head, still slick with viscous fluids, erupted through the rupture, followed by a matted, hairy limb, impossibly long and flexible. The creature was not fully formed. Parts of it were still horribly human. Patches of pale, taut skin, remnants of human hair clinging to its emerging form. But other parts were undeniably bestial, coarse, dark fur, razor-sharp claws, a muzzle distending, teeth like splintered bone. Fragments of human bone and gristle, shattered and twisted, clung to its developing form, a gruesome ornament of its horrific birth. A low, guttural shriek, a sound of agony and raw, primal hunger, tore from the thing's nascent throat. Its face, as it fully emerged from the rupturing skin, was the most horrifying detail. It was a nightmarish fusion. A human face, distended and grotesque, its features locked in a silent, agonizing scream, its eyes wide with a terror that belonged to the human it once was. Yet those eyes now glowed with an alien, predatory intelligence. That face was still undeniably part of the emerging beast, a sickening testament to the transformation, a permanent record of the unspeakable pain it had undergone during its birth. It was a spectacle of unimaginable suffering and perverse, monstrous creation, a sight that burned itself into Alex's memory with an icy, permanent brand. The single flashlight beam wavered, the trembling hand of the man holding it reflecting the terror that had just been unleashed. They had stumbled into a birthing chamber, a nest of nascent nightmares, and the horror had only just begun. The first emergence was a gruesome prelude. As the creature, still slick with birth fluids and human gore, ripped itself fully from its former host, a chain reaction of unimaginable horror tore through the suffocating confines of the cellar. A sickening symphony of wet, tearing sounds, of snapping bone and squelching flesh, filled the air. Other cocoons, previously still in their monstrous repose, began to convulse. They twitched, they writhed, they swelled, until the skin, stretched to its breaking point, burst open. Grotesque heads, hairy limbs, and raw, bleeding forms began to erupt from the torn human shells. The small, enclosed space transformed in seconds into a frenzied, hellish birthing room, a scene of absolute primordial chaos. Alex, propelled by a primal terror and a desperate surge of adrenaline, snapped out of his horrified stupor. Fire! He bellowed, his voice raw, and immediately brought his rifle to bear. The rifle cracked, the report deafening in the enclosed space. echoing with a violent concussive force. A creature, half-formed and still dripping with the remnants of its human incubator, stumbled as the bullet tore through its nascent chest. Frank, his face pale, but his eyes now blazing with a desperate animalistic courage, opened fire with his hunting rifle. Earl, screaming, swung his heavy logging axe in wide, panicked arcs, catching a newly birthed creature with a sickening thud. But its momentum carried it forward, a mass of snapping jaws and thrashing limbs. Elias, meanwhile, moved with a surprising agility for his age, an old, heavy axe appearing in his gnarled hands as if by magic. He brought it down with a sickening thud on the head of an emerging creature, splattering gore across the stone wall. The fight was brutal, chaotic, and utterly desperate. The creatures, though freshly born and still raw, were terrifyingly fast, moving with an unnatural, sinuous grace. Their claws, already sharp, raked at them in the dim light. Their newly formed teeth gnashed. They were strong, far stronger than any human, and possessed a horrifying vitality. Bullets tore through them, leaving gaping wounds. But they kept coming, screeching and snarling, their forms still a sickening blend of human and beast. Alex fired again and again, the acrid smell of gunpowder mingling with the foul stench of the cellar. He saw one creature, its eyes still a terrifying blend of human pupil and predatory gleam, lunge at Frank. Frank, with a roar of defiance, brought the butt of his rifle around, smashing it into the creature's face, buying himself a few precious seconds. In the deepening chaos, Earl, too focused on the creatures in front of him, was caught from behind. A blur of matted fur and clicking mandibles descended. He let out a choked gasp, his axe clattering to the floor as he was dragged backward into the deeper pulsing shadows of the cellar, his panicked cries abruptly cut short, swallowed by the guttural feeding sounds. Frank fought with a ferocity Alex hadn't seen before, a primal fury that burned bright in the face of absolute horror. He brought down one, then another, his rifle bucking in his hands, his face slick with sweat and gore. But the numbers were overwhelming. A new creature, its form still partially sheathed in the tattered remnants of a bloated human torso, burst from its cocoon behind him. Frank, focused on the monsters in front, never saw it. It latched onto his leg with a wet, tearing sound. He screamed, a guttural cry of agony, and fell. Alex tried to get a clear shot, but other creatures swarmed, a tangle of limbs and teeth. Frank was overwhelmed, dragged into a corner, his rifle ripped from his grasp. Alex watched, helpless, as Frank fought with his bare hands, his shouts turning to gurgles as the creatures tore into him. His last words, choked and ragged, a desperate final acknowledgement of the truth he had so stubbornly denied, tore through the cacophony. It wasn't just a bear, Alex. He gasped, the words barely audible, filled with a profound, terrifying regret. It was him. Then, silence. Frank was gone, his courage consumed by the endless hunger. Alex and Elias, battered, bleeding, and almost out of ammunition, knew their fight in the cellar was lost. Up. Now. Elias roared, pulling Alex by the arm. They scrambled backward, fighting a desperate rearguard action up the rickety wooden steps. Behind them, the sounds of tearing flesh and guttural feeding filled the cellar, a horrifying celebration of their loss. With a final desperate surge of strength, they burst through the cellar doors, slamming them shut against the horde of newborn nightmares. Alex, his lungs burning, his hand shaking, grabbed a heavy logging chain and frantically wrapped it around the rotting doors, then jammed a thick, splintered log through the handles, wedging it in place. The thudding and scratching from below began immediately, a frantic, ravenous sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Gasping for breath, covered in blood and the sickening bits of what they had just fought, Alex leaned against the cold, rough wood of the farmhouse wall. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving him weak and nauseated. He looked at Elias, whose face was grim, his eyes still holding the cold fire of battle. The true, soul-shattering meaning of what they had witnessed in that cellar finally solidified in Alex's mind. It wasn't just that these creatures existed, it was how they existed. The human element, the human form, was not merely a disguise or a facade. It was fundamental. It was intrinsic. It was the very matrix of their horrific life cycle. Humanity was not merely prey. It was part of the process. A chill that had nothing to do with the 40-degree Fahrenheit air seeped into Alex's very bones. The terror was not just outside them. It was within the very definition of what it meant to be human. In the relative, fragile safety of the dilapidated farmhouse, the sounds of the ravenous horde clawing at the barricaded cellar door reverberated like a demonic heartbeat. Alex slumped against a wall, his body screaming in protest, his mind reeling from the raw, visceral horror they had just escaped. He was covered in blood, sweat, and the vile ichor of the creatures, a deep, ragged cut on his forearm throbbing with a sickening rhythm. Elias, nursing a bruised shoulder, moved with a weary solemnity. Earl had been dragged into the gloom of the cellar, and now only two remained: Alex and Elias. Elias, his gaze distant, his voice a low, raspy whisper, began to reveal the full, horrifying depth of the truth. "They don't live among us, Alex," he reiterated, his eyes meeting Alex's with an unnerving intensity. "They are us. Not all of us, not yet. But they always have been here. Buried. Hidden." He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the entire world outside their fragile shelter. In the old stories, they spoke of a blood curse. But it was never about a bite turning a man. It was about an infection. A seed. Something planted within the human lineage generations ago, centuries ago. He explained the chilling hypothesis of the carrier. The turning isn't some magical transformation like the legends say. It's the parasite inside, maturing, reaching its full term. The human lives its entire life, completely unaware, a walking vessel, until the time is right. A powerful stress, a traumatic injury, even a simple, severe fever or a sudden shock can act as a trigger. A switch, Alex. A switch that flips, and then the incubation accelerates. The body, the human, becomes a cocoon from which something else bursts forth. Elias's words, delivered with a detached academic chill, were far more terrifying than any monster's growl. This truth was insidious, a violation of the most fundamental kind. It was the ultimate betrayal of one's own body, a secret, internal war raging within the very fabric of humanity. He looked at Alex, then out through a grimy window toward the indifferent forest. "My grandfather always said, 'Every third man has the wolf in his blood, though he may never know it.'" The words hung in the air, a devastating pronouncement, painting a horrifying picture of a world where 1 out of 3 people carried a dormant, monstrous secret. Elias pressed on, his voice filled with a grim urgency. "The turning can happen anywhere, at any time. In your home, at your work, in the subway, on a playground. The trigger is internal, a whisper from the alien within. It doesn't need the dark woods or a full moon. It just needs the right moment, the right spark, and the human form becomes what it was always intended to be. A biological incubator, a living chrysalis. The insidious, pervasive nature of this truth began to penetrate Alex's shattered mind. It wasn't a localized horror. It was a universal one. A silent, pervasive plague that infected the very essence of humanity. Elias then spoke of his family's history, a lineage not just of hunters, but of keepers. Fragmented knowledge, passed down through generations, hidden in whispers and warnings. He reached into his worn canvas pack and pulled out a small, ancient, leather-bound book. It was thin, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with archaic script and hand-drawn illustrations that depicted grotesque, transforming figures, their human faces contorted in agony as bestial features erupted from within. It was written in a language Alex didn't understand, but the chilling images spoke volumes. Elias pointed to an entry, his finger tracing faded, spattered ink. "My ancestors, they fled the old country, Alex. They brought these warnings with them. Stories from the 17th century, of villages wiped out, not by wolves, but by friends who suddenly turned." It was the ultimate horrifying confirmation, a direct link from the nightmares of Father Merrick's journal to the present, chilling reality. With this horrifying new understanding, their objective shifted irrevocably. Survival was no longer enough. The goal became to warn, to reveal this unspeakable truth to a world blissfully ignorant. Elias, visibly weakened by his injuries and the sheer emotional toll, pressed a crudely drawn map into Alex's hand. "This is your path," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "A hidden route, a game trail that leads to an old, deserted logging road. Follow it east. It will eventually take you to a small town about 50 miles from here. It's your only hope to reach someone, anyone, to tell them what you've seen." He locked eyes with Alex, a profound, desperate plea in their depths. "You have to make it, Alex. You're the only one who truly knows now. You're the only one left." The weight of this final directive, the immense burden of a world's horrifying truth, settled on Alex's shoulders. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a messenger, a lone, haunted prophet of a coming internal apocalypse. Leaving Elias behind, a solitary, resolute figure who promised to create a diversion, to hold them for as long as his old bones and dwindling ammunition allowed, Alex slipped out of the broken farmhouse. The night air, still damp and cold, bit at his exposed skin. He was badly wounded, a deep, ragged cut on his forearm seeping blood, his body racked with the kind of exhaustion that blurred the edges of reality. Each step was an agonizing effort, his muscles screaming in protest, his breath a raw rasp in his throat. But the urgency of Elias's desperate plea, the monumental weight of the truth he carried, propelled him forward, one painful step after another, into the indifferent maw of the forest. The woods, once a source of quiet comfort and natural beauty, had transformed into a vast, living tomb, every shadow a potential grave. The rhythmic rustle of leaves, the creak of branches in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. Every sound was now a threat, a phantom whisper of unseen horror. His senses, honed to a terrifying degree by days of relentless fear, were hyper-alert, but his body was failing him. His vision swam, his limbs trembled, and a dull, throbbing pain in his head threatened to overwhelm him. The forest pressed in, a suffocating blanket of black and gray, the trees looming like silent, accusing witnesses. He endured several heart-stopping, hair-thin escapes. He saw them now fully formed, their monstrous shapes moving with an impossible fluid grace through the dense undergrowth. One, its fur matted and dark, its limbs impossibly flexible, its head a brutal, wolf-like caricature, paused at the edge of a small clearing. Its eyes, twin points of dull, predatory light, caught Alex's gaze for a terrifying second before it melted back into the shadows. He understood then, with a chilling certainty, that they weren't just randomly hunting. They were seeking him, drawn by his scent, by the faint sounds of his struggle, by the knowledge that he carried. They were a pack, and he was the stray. But as he stumbled onward, through the deepening darkness and the chilling silence, a new, more insidious terror began to gnaw at him from within. Elias's words, "Every third man has the wolf in his blood," resonated in his mind like a poisoned mantra. His own body, previously a trusted vessel, now felt like a potential traitor. The deep gash on his forearm, sustained during the cellar battle, throbbed with a persistent, burning ache. Was it just a wound? Or was it something more? Was something growing within him? Was he a carrier? The thought was a sickening, corrosive acid that ate at his sanity. He would stop in the meager light of his dying flashlight, pulling back the torn fabric of his sleeve, staring at the angry red wound with a horrifying suspicion. He prodded it, as if expecting to feel something alien stirring beneath his skin, something coiling and preparing to burst forth. The psychological horror of internal betrayal was far worse than any external threat, a silent, relentless enemy that preyed on his mind. Hours blurred into an eternity of pain, fear, and doubt. The forest began to thin once more, the trees giving way to sparser woods, then to a more open scrubland. And then, through the wisps of the receding mist, he saw it. A distant faint glow on the horizon, a smudge of amber against the inky blackness of the pre-dawn sky. It was a light, a beacon in the vast darkness, a promise of salvation, of warning, of a world still untouched by the horrors he had witnessed. A desperate final surge of adrenaline, cold and fierce, coursed through his ravaged body, pushing him forward. He was almost there. He had to be. He had to warn them. He had to tell them the truth before it was too late, before the hidden horror blossomed within them all. Alex, his body a trembling wreck, his mind a fractured mosaic of fear and exhaustion, finally stumbled out of the dense forest. He emerged onto a deserted stretch of asphalt, a two-lane highway winding through fields that were now fallow and brown under the pale, indifferent pre-dawn sky. The first signs of human civilization, an old, dilapidated motel with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy and a gas station with a single lonely pump, seemed alien and terrifying after the raw, untamed horror of the woods. They were monuments to a world he no longer recognized, a world he now saw through a prism of unspeakable dread. A few cars whizzed by, their headlights cutting bright, transient paths through the gloom, their tires hissing on the damp pavement. He heard the faint, distant thrum of music, a pop song from an unseen radio. For a fleeting moment, a wave of profound, overwhelming relief washed over him. Civilization. Safety. The chance to speak, to warn. But it was immediately followed by a chilling, visceral doubt, a cold hand clenching around his heart. Elias's words, the terrifying truth of the carrier, echoed in his mind, drowning out the fragile hope. Every third man. The numbers shifted, twisted, becoming a grotesque, all-encompassing threat. He moved cautiously like a wounded animal, keeping to the shadows along the edge of the road. His destination was a small, brightly lit diner further down the road, its windows glowing with an inviting warmth that felt deeply, dangerously false. Through the steamy glass, he observed the mundane tableau within. Ordinary people. Families, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the overhead lights, sat in booths, sharing breakfast. A pair of burly, long-haul truckers, their faces tired but relaxed, hunched over steaming mugs of coffee at the counter. A young waitress, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, chatted idly as she wiped down the counter. It was a scene of absolute comforting normalcy, a slice of Americana preserved under fluorescent light. But Alex's perception was now fundamentally corrupted by the horrors he had witnessed. His eyes, trained to find the minute deviations, the telltale signs, began to pick apart the familiar scene, revealing a horrifying undercurrent. A man in a baseball cap, sitting with his wife and two small children, chewed his scrambled eggs with a frightening ferocity, his jaw muscles working with an unnatural prominence, his gaze fixed on his plate with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Across the diner, an elderly woman sipping tea breathed with a heavy, too-deep rhythm, almost a rasp, even in her apparent state of rest. It was the sound of a lung working harder than it should, indicating a throat struggling with something that was not meant to be there. A small child, no more than 5, caught Alex's eye through the window. For a split second, its innocent face contorted into a strange, almost hungry grin, its eyes catching the light with a disconcerting, almost predatory glint before it dissolved back into the wide-eyed wonder of childhood. Then, his gaze locked onto a man at the counter, a burly figure in a denim jacket, paying his bill. As the man turned to leave, Alex saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible line on the back of his neck where the skin was stretched too taut, almost cracking under some unseen internal pressure. It was just a thin, delicate seam, barely visible beneath the collar of his jacket. But within that fine line, beneath the taut skin, Alex saw a tiny, almost iridescent shimmer, a faint, rainbow-like gleam, like oil on water moving just beneath the surface. It was gone in an instant, obscured by the man's movement, but Alex had seen it. His breath caught in his throat, a cold, desperate gasp. The world, he realized, was not as he thought it was. The faint, almost iridescent shimmer on the back of the man's neck, the nearly invisible seam where the skin seemed stretched to its breaking point. It was the last devastating piece of the puzzle. It shattered the illusion of normalcy, ripping it to shreds with the force of a thunderclap. Alex's mind flashed back to the cellar, to the bursting cocoons, to the grotesque, half-formed creatures erupting from human shells. Elias's words, so casually delivered, so utterly horrifying, echoed in his ears with a deafening certainty. Every third man has the wolf in his blood, though he may never know it. The ordinary street, the brightly lit diner, the mundane rhythm of human life. It all warped instantly, seen through a new, terrifying prism. The subtle deviations he had dismissed as quirks of human behavior, the fierce chewing, the heavy breathing, the predatory gleam in a child's eyes, they were no longer just anomalies. They were signs, undeniable, horrifying. Each tiny imperfection was a clue, a secret language written on the faces and bodies of the unsuspecting. A wave of cold, visceral panic washed over him, making his vision swim. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to scan the street, to truly see. His eyes darted from face to face, from movement to movement, searching for the tells. He saw more of them. A teenager, slouching against a lamp-post, his gait a strange, almost clumsy shuffle, as if his limbs were not quite his own. A woman pushing a stroller, her smile too wide, almost predatory, revealing too much gum, too many teeth. He noticed the way some people subtly avoided eye contact, their gazes skittering away, while others held it for just a fraction of a second too long, a chilling, assessing stare. It was everywhere. Once he knew what to look for, he couldn't unsee it. His perception of the world had undergone a profound, irreversible shift. He began to perceive the world not just with his eyes, but with a new, horrifying internal sense. He discerned a faint, earthy aroma from some individuals, a subtle scent of damp soil and something wild, something that belonged not in a bustling town, but in the deep, primeval forest. And beneath the cacophony of normal human sounds, the distant traffic, the murmur of conversations, the clatter of plates, he detected a low internal hum, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the crowd itself, like a suppressed heartbeat, a collective, silent thrumming of something ancient and terrible. It was the whisper of a pack, a hidden current running beneath the river of humanity. Then the ultimate terrifying understanding crashed down upon him, crushing any last vestige of hope or sanity. It wasn't just every third person. That was merely a starting point, a rough estimate. It was far more pervasive, far more encompassing. The creatures weren't hiding in the deep shadows of the forest, waiting for their moment. They weren't an invading force from outside. They were the shadows. They were the light. They were the mundane. They were here, not as invaders, but as an inherent, hidden truth. They were humanity, a deeply intertwined, monstrous part of it. The lines had blurred, then dissolved entirely. The enemy was not external. It was internal. It was everywhere. And it was us. Alex stood alone on the brightly lit street, the harsh glare of the diner's sign a cruel mockery against the profound internal darkness that had just swallowed his world whole. He was surrounded, utterly surrounded, by what he now understood to be an immense, interconnected, utterly unsuspecting network of carriers and hidden predators. The truth, in its terrible finality, was not a secret to be revealed, but a fundamental reality to be acknowledged. It wasn't hidden in forgotten lore or ancient forests. It was woven into the very fabric of existence, a silent, pervasive horror that had always been and would always be. The war he had just fought, the desperate struggle for survival in the deep woods, was a pathetic skirmish against a symptom, a futile effort against a localized manifestation. The true invasion had not happened in some recent, cataclysmic event. It had occurred centuries, even millennia ago. Humanity had never had a chance because humanity had never been truly separate from the enemy. The very concept of us versus them was a naive, comforting lie that had now been incinerated by the brutal fire of revelation. There was only them, and we were merely the means to their propagation, the unwilling incubators for their endless, monstrous cycle. The weight of this knowledge was a crushing, suffocating burden. It was more than just fear. It was a profound existential despair that hollowed him out, leaving him utterly empty. Hope, that most persistent of human illusions, had finally withered and died within him. There was no escape, no warning to be given, no battle to be won. The fight was lost before it even began, because the enemy was already inside, already everywhere. There was no fortress strong enough, no weapon sharp enough to combat an enemy that was, in essence, the very thing it sought to destroy. He watched a young couple laughing, their backs to him, as they strolled down the sidewalk, bathed in the garish glow of a passing streetlight. He saw it again, the faint, almost iridescent shimmer on the back of the man's neck, the subtle, almost undetectable tension in the skin. He noticed the way the woman's movements seemed just a fraction too fluid, too effortless, a whisper of predatory grace in her casual stride. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that at any moment a hidden switch could flip. A stressor, a trauma, a fever, anything could be the trigger. The cocoon would burst. The human would cease to be. Alex raised his eyes to the bustling street, to the shimmering city lights in the distance, to the swirling shadows and the ceaseless hum of human activity. He understood now. Humanity didn't live alongside the creatures of legend. Humanity was the pack. He stood there, a lone, terrified observer, intimately bound to this unspeakable horror, trapped within a silent, monstrous conspiracy, a world now revealed as nothing more than a vast, unwitting nursery for the things that stirred within. The story wasn't over. It had just begun, and he was now a part of it.